Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother's name Mary? And are not his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas?
The study of the Protoevangelium of James places us before a fundamental paradox. It is a text that never obtained canonical recognition, but whose influence was so marked that it crossed centuries and shaped, to a large extent, the spirituality, art, and even theology of Christianity. The mere fact that an apocryphal gospel was able to nourish devotions, inspire liturgical feasts, and profoundly influence Marian iconography shows the complexity of the transmission of the faith in the first centuries of the Church. If the canonical Gospels were the backbone of Christian doctrine, the Protoevangelium of James can be seen as the flesh and blood that filled in the narrative gaps and met human curiosities about Mary and the childhood of Jesus. It does not speak with the same authority as the recognized scriptures, but speaks with the voice of the community that produced it, a voice that expresses theological, social, and cultural concerns of the second century. In this sense, studying it does not only mean revisiting an ancient literary curiosity, but opening a window to understand how early Christianity sought to defend itself from external criticism, organize their internal beliefs, and give shape to a devotion that, centuries later, would be considered central to the Christian tradition. The relevance of this text lies not only in what it says about Mary and Joseph, but also in what it reveals about the Church itself in its infancy, a community that needed to affirm the purity of Jesus' mother in the face of hostile accusations, that it wished to explain the tension between Mary's virginity and the mention of Jesus' brothers, which sought, finally, a narrative capable of uniting theology and catechesis, apologetics and devotion. The Protoevangelium of James is not only literature, but also resistance, creativity, and faith embodied in history. Thus, this study proposes an in-depth and multifaceted reading of the text, divided into 5 major parts. First, a dive into its historical and cultural context. Then, a detailed literary analysis. Then, the exploration of his Marian theology, the consideration of its reception and influence in the Christian tradition, and finally, a look at contemporary academic readings and debates. This journey will allow us not only to better understand one of the most significant works of apocryphal Christianity, but also to understand how non-canonical texts can, paradoxically, become fundamental to the history of the Christian faith.
The Protoevangelium of James is one of the most fascinating and influential texts of early Christianity, yet it has been relegated to the realm of the so-called Apocryphal Gospels. Probably written in the middle of the 2nd century, the text is not part of the New Testament canon, but its circulation was wide, influencing both Marian devotion and the liturgical and artistic tradition of the Church. To understand the importance of this work, it is necessary to delve into its historical, cultural, and theological context, perceiving how it fits into the identity disputes of nascent Christianity. Although it is attributed to James, the brother of the Lord, modern criticism is unanimous in recognizing the pseudepigraphical nature of this authorship. The name of James confers apostolic authority and closeness to Jesus, but the language, narrative style, and theological concerns of the text reveal a late composition, far removed from the original circle of the apostles. Everything indicates that the Protoevangelium was produced in Greek-speaking Christian communities, probably in Syria or Egypt, regions where Marian worship and devotion to virginity flourished in a particular way. In this environment, the text was born as a response to the internal concerns of the communities and the external criticism that Christianity faced. In fact, in the 2nd century, the young Christian religion found itself in tension with Judaism and under the suspicious gaze of the pagan world. Intellectuals such as the philosopher Celsus, a staunch opponent of Christians, accused Jesus of illegitimacy, attributing his conception to an adultery between Mary and a Roman soldier named Panther. In addition, the scandal of the cross and the humble character of Jesus' family were exploited to discredit his messianic claim. The Protoevangelium of James responds to these criticisms in narrative form, extolling Mary's purity, the sanctity of her conception, and the divine providence that surrounds the entire story of Jesus' birth. At the same time, it provides an explanation for the mention of the brothers of Jesus in the canonical Gospels, presenting them as Joseph's children from a previous marriage, and thus preserving Mary's virginity. The text, therefore, should not be read as a historical account in the modern sense, but as narrative theology. It does not seek to reconstruct facts, but to offer a symbolic and catechetical interpretation of events, filling in the gaps left by the canonical Gospels. The story of the barrenness of Joachim and Hannah, Mary's parents, follows the pattern of barren Old Testament couples, such as Abraham and Sarah or Hannah and Elkanah, reinforcing the continuity between the Old and New covenants. Mary's presentation to the temple, her life of purity, and the drawing of lots for Joseph as its guardian are elements that, in addition to marking the providential character of her mission, respond to doctrinal concerns that emerged strongly. How to reconcile Mary's virginity with the birth of Jesus and with her insertion into a family.
In this sense, the Protoevangelium of James also stands as a counterpoint to the Gnostic currents which flourished at the same time. While many Gnostics despised matter, sexuality, and the body, the apocryphal text values corporeality but presents it transfigured by grace. Mary's birth is described as miraculous, without pain or loss of virginity, signaling that the body is not denied but sanctified. Mary appears as a true living temple, a figure in whom the divine is fully manifested. Thus, although the Protoevangelium shares the plural religious environment of the 2nd century, it distinguishes itself from the Gnostic tendencies by reaffirming the incarnation and the materiality of salvation. In addition to the dialogue with Judaism and Gnosticism, the text also reflects Greco-Roman cultural influences. The valorization of virginity refers in part to models known in the pagan world, such as the Vestal Virgins in Rome. But here, it is reinterpreted in the light of the Christian faith. Similarly, the idea of miraculous births, common in Hellenistic myths, is reconfigured within the biblical tradition. Thus, Mary emerges as a singular figure who, at the same time, dialogues with broader cultural symbols and subverts them, inscribing them in the history of salvation. From a sociological point of view, the Protoevangelium also reveals how early Christianity elaborated new possibilities for female identity. In the Greco-Roman world, women were generally confined to the domestic space, defined above all by their role as wife and mother. The text, however, presents Mary as a model of consecration, purity, and centrality in the history of salvation. Obedient and humble, but also elevated and chosen, she inaugurated a path that would later be taken up by monastic life and Christian spirituality, in which virginity would become an ideal of holiness. In this way, the Apocrypha contributes not only to Marian theology, but to the redefinition of the role of women within the Christian tradition. It is not surprising, therefore, that the reception of the Protoevangelium of James has been ambiguous. Church fathers such as Origen and Jerome knew it and partly used it to respond to criticism against Mary and Jesus. At the same time, the Church never recognized him as inspired, and his exclusion from the canon was confirmed in the following centuries, most notably by the Council of Trent in the 16th century. Many liturgical feasts linked to Mary, such as the Nativity of the Virgin and her presentation in the temple, derive directly from the apocryphal narratives. Christian art, from Byzantine mosaics to medieval painting, drew inspiration from his descriptions. The popular imagination, in turn, perpetuated the stories of Joachim and Anne, Mary's childhood, and Joseph's profile as an elder guardian, shaping Marian devotion over the centuries.
In modern academic research, the Protoevangelium of James continues to be studied from multiple perspectives. Some, such as James H. Charlesworth,
consider it a privileged window into the popular Christianity of the 2nd century, more concerned with feeding the piety of the faithful than with formulating dogmas. Bart D. Ehrman points out that its exclusion from the canon was not only due to doubtful authorship, but also to its emphasis on Mary, considered secondary to the centrality of Christ in the canonical Gospels. Other scholars, such as Georges Macrae, draw attention to its catechetical function. By telling charming and accessible stories, the text consolidated the faith and responded to the spiritual needs of communities. Thus, the Protoevangelium of James can be understood as a bridge between devotion and doctrine. It is not inspired scripture, but neither is it mere folk legend. It is a precious testimony of how early Christianity sought to affirm its identity in the face of criticism, to respond to internal doubts, and, above all, to exalt the holiness of Mary and the miraculous character of the birth of Jesus. Its permanence over the centuries proves that, even outside the canon, the text has found a place in the living tradition of the Church, influencing Christian faith, art, and spirituality to this day. The Protoevangelium of James reminds us that the Christian faith was not only forged in dogmatic counsels and treatises, but also in popular narratives, in texts that circulated by word of mouth, in stories that responded to the anxieties and hopes of concrete communities. To study this Apocrypha is to rediscover the richness and plurality of early Christianity, recognizing that tradition is always greater than the canon, and that popular devotion played a crucial role in shaping what we now call the Church. However, this dive should not end in a merely historical look. The challenge for us, contemporary readers, is to let the Protoevangelium of James provoke us to ask us current questions. How do we welcome the diversity of expressions of faith today? How do we balance popular devotion and theological reflection? How do we preserve the centrality of Christ without losing sight of the importance of figures who, like Mary, embody the human response to the mystery of the Incarnation? In light of this, the call that this study makes is clear. Let us not reduce Christianity to the narrow boundaries of what has been canonized, but let us make room to understand how marginal texts, practices, and memories have helped shape the faith of millions over the centuries. Studying the Protoevangelium of James is not just an academic task, it is also a spiritual and pastoral exercise, which can enrich our understanding of the Christian mystery and challenge us to integrate with humility and openness the multiplicity of voices that echo from the first centuries of the Church.
The Gospel of James shows us that the Christian faith is much more complex and profound than we imagine, a text forgotten, censored, and almost lost, but which still echoes today like a whisper from the past, asking to be rediscovered. Now, it's up to you to accept only what you've always been told, or dare to seek the truth hidden in the forbidden Gospels. If this video moved you, don't leave without leaving your like and sharing it so that more people know this story. Sign up for the Forbidden Chapter and check back here for the next episode, because there are still a lot of secrets to be revealed.